Okay, perfect. All right. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. We're excited to have Ken Smoller with us. He's the author of the last Comiskey book, which is the companion piece to the unbelievable documentary that's available on YouTube by Matt Flesch and others. Ken, why don't you just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what the book's about?
Sure, sure. Thanks for having me. Great to be at my hometown SABR group, even though I live over in Boston. Um, I am going to break this up into three different parts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. Then I'll talk a bit about how the book came together. And then we're going to go through just a series of what if questions that will delve into ballpark history and kind of where we've gone and where we're going to potentially go in the future in the ballpark situation in Chicago. So, just going to start off with going into a little bit of background about how the Last Comiskey book came about. So, as I mentioned, was born in suburban Chicago, or actually in south side of Chicago, and at Michael Reese. Grew up in Arlington Heights, which of course is going to be potentially the future home of the Bears, but it certainly is no longer home to this glorious racetrack that existed for a number of years. Growing up in the northwest suburbs, I certainly was one of very few White Sox fans. So for that reason, I always wore an obnoxious amount of White Sox clothing everywhere that I went. And would do things, my fascination with ballparks really early on, compelled me to do things like turn my room into Comiskey Park or try to draw Comiskey Park. And I was really looking for some sort of creative outlet. And lo and behold, in 1982, my parents took me to Camera Day, and I brought my old Kodak 110 camera to Camera Day and got to see such stars as Bull Lazinski and Carlton Fisk and Julio Cruz, etc. And that really is where I caught the bug for photography, roaming around the park, getting to see a birthday message on the scoreboard, but really exploring Comiskey Park as an 11 or 12-year-old kid and kind of taking in the entire experience, whether it was Harry Carey or Nancy Faust or Andy the Clown or the shoe shine guy, etc. And, after that, I started to become really interested in photography. Took a few classes. Naturally, my still life was not plants or fruit. It was my all my Sox gear. And I would bring my camera to the ballpark as much as I could, particularly for big days like opening day, where I'd see the likes of Ron Kittle or Harold Baines come out during the lineup introductions, or the infamous or famous, depending on how you look at them, Ribby and Rhubarb, who as a kid I kind of dug, but were much derided by the fans of Chicago, for those of you who remember. But little by little, I've started to become a better photographer and using telephoto lenses and getting action shots, such as this one of Carlton Fisk or Ozzie Guillen on opening day. And I try to bring the camera, like I said, to big events. If there was a real big team coming in town or the Crosstown Classic, I would roam around the park, see who was there. I sometimes got lucky and got, Iron Mike Ditka when he was throwing out the first pitch after opening game in '86, after the Super Bowl shuffle team won the Super Bowl. And really, Comiskey Park was part of my childhood. It was something that it hit all the senses. It hit, the shaking sounds of the scoreboard when it would explode. You'd smell the sulfur kind of permeating the ballpark. You'd hear Nancy Faust. You really kind of felt the ballpark, unlike ballparks today. I went on to high school at Buffalo Grove High School and started to become a young photojournalist working for the school newspaper, capturing, both news events and sports events at the time. Chicago, Illinois was a purple state in those days. So both presidential candidates came through the suburbs in 1988. And I would also take my camera all over the city and capture the city, but really sports were my love. And I wanted to go to college where I could really do something with my sports photography. Um, After learning more and more about how to do it at Soldier Field and um, trying to do things like capture my favorite players, such as trying to get Walter Payton before he retired on film, or going to Chicago Stadium and trying to get Michael Jordan. Early on, I just had a little point and shoot camera, and I would get as close as I could to where they came out. And after a little while, I was getting better. And this is from the '88 All Star Slam Dunk competition, where I was starting to use telephoto lenses and become more of a photographer. As I mentioned before, I grew up a Sox fan in Cubs country. And my father was so adamant about not going to Wrigley Field, he would not take me until the Crosstown Classic started in 1985, which was an exhibition game between the Cubs and the Sox, alternating between the two parks. You got to see a lot of the young stars at that point, such as Bobby Bonilla during his brief time of the White Sox before heading off to Pittsburgh and later the New York Mets. After that, I did get to Wrigley Field now and then. I was lucky enough to be there for the first night game when my aunt was on the Let There Be Lights committee and was able to get tickets. Being part of that was tremendous history, really exciting until, of course, the rains came and wiped out 8-8-88 and turned 8-9-88 against the Mets into the real first night game at Wrigley Field. But as I got my driver's license, I started to explore the country a little bit more. I went and Canada. I went to Toronto to Exhibition Stadium to see the White Sox play, and Cleveland Municipal Stadium and Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, and decided to take this to Ann Arbor, where I went to the University of Michigan, and I joined the student newspaper at the time, which was really an entree into seeing big time sports and bigger stadiums and traveling and getting beyond the bounds of the northwest suburbs of Arlington Heights. And I was really lucky at the time because Michigan was a real top sports school then. The football team was good, but in particular, the basketball team was really exciting. The Fab Five, for those of you may remember, came to school my junior year, and the team really captured the imagination of the sports world. And I was there front row, getting to photograph them from all different angles, including this shot that I took up in the rafters that day against IU. And I got to cover them all the way through the Final Four and a surprising NCAA tournament in 1992, where they ended up losing to Duke by 20 points in the championship game. But it gave me an opportunity to see big time events and see what it would be like to become a professional photographer. I didn't really care at that time whether or not my past said I could go onto the court. I just went there. I didn't really ask for permission. I asked for forgiveness instead. I did get, a photo on the cover of Sports Illustrated, sort of. There I am in the corner in the background. Um, but I did, get my mug on TV now and then. It was pretty useful for professors who kind of wanted to know where I was. They at least could see me, and I got out of taking certain exams. Um, but Michigan ultimately is a football school, and I got to cover Desmond Howard, who didn't have the greatest of NFL careers, but did win the Super Bowl MVP with the dreaded Packers, but won the Heisman Trophy during the time that he was at Michigan. And I got to cover all of those games, which was really quite a treat, getting to see him perform his Heisman posts against Ohio State. My big regret in college was focusing on an econ exam rather than going to see at the Downtown Athletic Club in New York, Desmond Howard get his Heisman Trophy award from a guy that would soon become somewhat infamous, which was O.J. Simpson here. I got to cover these great events like the Rose Bowl and the Final Four, but decided to go the legit course of action and went to Philadelphia for law school. So I decided instead of becoming a professional photographer, I was going to do this on the side as a hobby for a period of time, and instead, explore it when I could, and got to, explore Philadelphia and their great stadiums, and started to drive up and down the East Coast. I got to go to the 96 All-Star game while studying for the bar, grabbing myself a single standing room only ticket for off the street from a ticket seller. But went on to really, the sort of boring law firm law experience in New York. You're not going to see a whole heck of a lot of photos from these days because I was spending most of the time reading things like loan documents or mortgages or deeds or things like that. Despite the appearances, I never really got to a court. This is a brief charity tour of the Supreme Court. I did get to meet Bob Costas at a sports event. So every now and then the firm would give us tickets to big events, including before the Yankees became the dreaded Yankees of their dynasty era. Jeter was a young rookie who was capturing the imagination of New York City in a drought at that point in time. And he went on to lead the Yankees to win the first of what became their run of success in the late 90s, early aughts. Every now and then, I would affiliate more with the Mets fans, given that they were the second team in the city. And as the White Sox are certainly known as being the second, if not third, fourth, fifth team in Chicago. Um, so I got to do that, but I ended up moving up to Boston, and I now live in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is just 2 miles down the road from Fenway Park. Again, not a lot of photos from this era of sporting events because this is really what I saw mainly was my office and papers. And as I got a little older, my hours went down a bit, and I got back to traveling a bit and got to Fenway Park, and that became my home ballpark, and I got to experience that the way I got to experience Comiskey Park and really got to soak in what it was like at an old ballpark. Um, from a Sox perspective, one of the biggest events was when the White Sox finally broke their 88-year curse of just winning a playoff series. They finally won the ALDS in 2005 against the champion Red Sox, who, of course, had come back and broke their own 86-year curse the year before. There were about 1,000 White Sox fans in attendance, and after the game, the players came on the field and showered us all with champagne. And 2 weeks later, the White Sox ended up winning the World Series. I decided after the Astros had gone down to that 0-2 hole, I was going to find somehow a cheap ticket on eBay and fly through a couple different airports and get down there and capture what became the most important photograph I ever took, other than, of course, the birth of my children, which has to, I guess, theoretically be number one. Being in Boston, I got to watch Michigan alum Tom Brady do his thing and capture a whole bunch of Super Bowls, which, those Chicagoans that I grew up with didn't get to see that too many times. But the other great Chicago sports moment happened in this town as well. Just taking the green line down the street, I got to see the Blackhawks come back and beat the Boston Bruins to win the Stanley Cup in 2013 after the great 17-second two-goal run. But I became a dad. I started to raise my kids the right way as much as I could, raising my kid as a Sox fan, despite being in a mixed marriage with a Red Sox fan. You can see the White Sox are still getting second billing on my kid's first birthday cake. But, I take them to Chicago as much as I can. I bribe them with merch as much as I'm able to. And they become White Sox fans along with Red Sox to the extent that they care about baseball in their generation. Soccer is my other great love. I watch a lot of soccer games. I go all around Europe or Latin America or the States to catch their soccer and really try to embrace whatever sport I can see when I'm going to visit places. I always feel that that's the best way to learn a culture is through their sporting events, through their architecture, their stadiums, their food, their personality, their music, the chanting, the way they sing, the way they focus on things. You know, you really get to understand a place. Here's Minnesota, the Vikings Stadium. The last one was, by the way, the Navy playing against Air Force in Annapolis. One of my most amazing experiences was seeing Japanese baseball. Here are the Hanshin Tigers, often known as the Red Sox of Japan, being sort of the second team to the Tokyo Giants, which would be the New York Yankees. Great experiences there. They have cheerleaders. They, before COVID, used to let balloons go during the seventh inning stretch and all kinds of different types of foods that you wouldn't see here, and really just a completely different cultural experience. Not to mention getting a chance to go see sumo down the road as well. But, I little by little got to all the old major league ballparks. I finally hit the 30 existing ballparks in the late 90s or early aughts when I got to Atlanta. Of course, you got to keep going back because for every new one gets torn down. I try to embrace a lot of different sports. I've seen curling in Lowell, Massachusetts, or hurling in Dublin, Ireland, cricket in London, squash at the Boston Symphony, really anything that's a stadium I try to get to. I'll even go venture into rodeo in Guthrie, Oklahoma, or lucha libre in Mexico City. But my true love is baseball, and I try to get to ballparks wherever I can go. Here's one just a few weeks ago in Tijuana, the Tijuana Toros, or when the Expos briefly took over some time in San Juan, Puerto Rico, near the end of their time in Montreal, which we'll get to later on. Or here's the first Major League Baseball game in Mexico City, the Padres versus the Giants at Harpaloo outside of the center of Mexico. Or this great ballpark, which is a minor league ballpark, if anyone recognizes it, it sadly no longer exists. It is in Camden, New Jersey, right in front of the Ben Franklin Bridge. Campbell's Park or Stadium, which was torn down a few years ago and is now where I believe Rutgers Camden plays college baseball. Or here's right before the Field of Dreams game. This is from the top of the Ferris wheel in Davenport. I'm sure a lot of you folks have been to this great ballpark on the Mississippi River. Or one of my favorites of all time, and really brings me back to Comiskey Park, which is Birmingham's Rickwood Field, which of course just hosted Major League Baseball for the first time a few weeks ago. But my home ballpark, of course, is Fenway Park, which is pretty wonderful. And as was mentioned earlier, I've now been to about 2,400 stadiums worldwide. Not always for sporting events. Not always have I gotten inside, but I've either gotten a photo of the inside or the exterior of 2,400 stadiums worldwide. And for years, people were asking me, well, what the heck are you going to do with all this? And I didn't know. And at the time, I'm like, I don't have time. I'm a lawyer. I've got 2 little kids. What am I going to do with this? And then, I went through a career change. Right before COVID began, I went with a buddy of mine to Canada. We're going to see some hockey up at Edmonton. And little did I know this was going to be one of the last sporting events with fans to attend in the world for a period of time, because the very next day, gatherings were banned throughout the world. And my pursuit then became trying to get toilet paper for my house back in Boston, because Canada was about a week behind the States and still had stashes of toilet paper. So that was my pursuit at the time. And this is about as close as I got to the Calgary Flames game, seeing the outside of the Saddle Dome in -4 Fahrenheit weather, because nothing was open and I was worried about even getting back to Boston. So I decided to start a sports travel blog at the time called Stadium Vagabond. I had sat on that name for a while and decided, you know what, this is an opportunity to share my stories, both in written and photographic form. I really just wanted to get my photos out for people to see. And I started to share them on social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram at Stadium Vagabond. But I also started to do long form pieces that would incorporate not just the X's and the O's of a particular sporting event, but what is it like to go to a game at SoFi Stadium, or what did it feel like to be at the Field of Dreams for the White Sox great comeback over the Yankees? And fast forward a bit, and Matt Flesch, a first-time documentarian, put out this tweet asking for photos and videos to contribute to his documentary to be called Last Comiskey. And I was thrilled to reach out to him, because I finally thought, okay, this is an opportunity to share my photos with baseball fans and White Sox fans that have been sitting there gathering dust in negative form. And, this was really a product of 80s technology. I had negatives stored in VHS boxes in my storage room. And little by little, I would scan them in and send them over to Matt. And, I was lucky enough during the final year of Old Comiskey to use my affiliation with Michigan to get a press pass for one game. And it was ostensibly to photograph Jim Abbott, who was at the time playing for the California Angels. And those of you who don't remember him, was a pretty fine pitcher, ended up throwing a no-hitter for the Yankees, was a good USA baseball player for the Pan Am games, but also happened to only have one arm. Yet he still was a pretty adept fielder despite having only one arm. So I used that as an entree to get a press pass. And to my surprise and amazement, I got it. Went to go talk to Jim, who couldn't have been a nicer guy, but then really used that opportunity to photograph every nook and cranny of Comiskey Park. I felt like someone needed to remember this park on film. If it was not me, someone else was doing it, but I want to make sure I at least had these memories. So I went to parts of the ballpark that I had never been in my life. I went to go see what it was like to sit in the umpire's view of home plate. I even ended up befriending, oddly, Dave Winfield, who reached out to me as a young college photographer, about 19 years old at the time, who asked me to photograph him at his various last moments at Old Comiskey. He was a student of the game and really valued the history, and he brought me right next to him in the dugout and took a bunch of photos of him, and it was really a special experience. But I went to all kinds of places. I got to go inside the locker room and got to talk to manager Jeff Torborg after a real tough loss on a day that the clubhouse had a broken air conditioning. He still spent about 5-10 minutes with me chatting about his memories of old Comiskey Park for a story that I was going to work on for the Michigan Daily when I got back to college that summer or that fall. But I continued throughout that summer, going back as much as I could with my camera and taking the exterior or the interior, the little nooks and the crannies, the parts of the ballpark that you didn't always see, such as the picnic area out in left field, or the walkway out in deep center field, which was one of my favorite places to watch a couple innings of a game where you just kind of got a different sense of what it was like. But as the season wore on, the new park was starting to literally cast its shadow on the old park. Oh, I'm sorry. I also tried to capture all the people of the old park, including Nancy Faust, who is a huge part of the documentary, but also a huge part of the book as well, and a huge part of the memories of White Sox fans for the 41 seasons in which she played. The book includes a very big component on Nancy, as well as a chapter at the end and the afterward about who Nancy is as a human being beyond just a wonderful part of baseball history. Um, the team was really exciting that year. They had a lot of young players. Frank Thomas was called up for a Brewers game in August and had a 2-month stint at Old Comiskey Park, largely at first base at the time. Jack McDowell was in his third year, I believe, after also being drafted like Frank, #1 a few years prior. In addition, Robert Ventura was recently called up, another #1 draft pick. Alex Fernandez would be the fourth #1 draft pick. But beyond that, there was a young, skinny guy named Sammy Sosa, who was a triples hitter, stolen base guy, a little bit of flashy defense, sometimes some pretty bad boneheaded plays, but definitely not someone that you would have thought would go on to hit that many home runs with or without the aid of any substances. But here he is on the day that I had that press pass. Not a real chatty guy. His English was a little poor at that time. It was a record-breaking year. Bobby Thigpen set the record with 57 saves, breaking Dennis Eckersley's record, and held that record for quite a while. I think it was 18 years until K-Rod broke it with, I believe now it's 62 saves, or was at the time was his record. There was also veteran leadership with Carlton Fisk still manning this young pitching staff. And although still a young guy, Ozzie Guillen was named co-manager along with Carlton Fisk co-captain by manager Jeff Torborg along with Carlton Fisk. So he really was kind of the leader of the young guys. You had some weird events that happened during that year. I was happened to be lucky enough to be there for July 1st, which is Comiskey Park's birthday or anniversary. Andy Hawkins of the Yankees was a starting pitcher on a real sunny, windy, unseasonably cool day in July, and a real high sky led to two outfielders dropping easy fly balls for errors. The White Sox ended up winning the game 4-0 without the benefit of a hit. It was called a no-hitter at the time. It has since been relabeled as a 8-inning no-hit game by the buzzkill Fay Vincent, who decided to recategorize what constitutes a no-hitter. But moving forward, as I said before, the new park was starting to cast a literal shadow on the old park. And you're starting to realize that our days were numbered. And sadly for the White Sox, they didn't have enough juice. Pun may be intended there. Didn't have enough juice to catch the A's in the end, who, led by old White Sox manager Tony La Russa, ended up winning the AL West by 10 games. The White Sox won, I believe it was 94 games. However, before the days of the wild card, which wouldn't get introduced for a few years, they went home, sadly, without any postseason play. Karma was a bitch, though, for the A's, and they ended up getting swept by the Reds in the playoffs that season, or in the World Series that year. So we get to the last weekend of Old Comiskey Park. I drove back from Ann Arbor because my late Uncle Gary, who was a season ticket holder, was able to get a couple face value tickets for me and my then girlfriend at the time. And we went to the final night game and the final day game. And it was a real sad, melancholy feel on that last day people were walking around taking photos. You often saw the park didn't look full, but everyone was walking around getting video and photos. And it was just a surreal experience seeing this park for the last time, culminating with the team coming out doing a victory lap for a real successful season. But it kind of caused me to realize we're never going to see them do this after a World Series at Old Comiskey. And today I'm wearing actually my Chicago Cardinals shirt because it's probably not a good time to celebrate the White Sox, given that they're already over a century in losses. But the Chicago Cardinals are the only team that actually won a championship for the city of Chicago in this ballpark. The LA Dodgers won in 1959, but neither the White Sox, who won on the road in the Polo Grounds in 1917, and in 1906, they beat the Cubs at the South Side Grounds a few blocks south on 39th. The Sting won their championships on the road in Toronto, and the Chicago American Giants of the Negro Leagues also never won a championship at Comiskey Park. So only the Chicago Cardinals got to say that they were a champion who celebrated on the field for Chicago at Comiskey. So the movie gets released and gets really rave reviews from just all over the baseball world. And Matt and I discussed at SABR last year at the Palmer House in Chicago, how could we create something that fans would have as a permanent keepsake beyond just this YouTube video? And by the way, the film is fully available on YouTube for free. There are 3 parts. It's available on DVD on Matt's website, lastcomiskey.com. And it's a wonderful film. And we try to figure out how can we capture the spirit of the film, but in book form. And it really started to come together when Ozzie Guillen agreed to do the intro and provide the introduction for the book and talked about what was it like to raise his kids at Comiskey Park and really what the family experience was like at Comiskey Park compared to the newer parks, both new Comiskey, but just the parks today, which doesn't have the same intimate feeling that we all got to experience with the old parks of our youth. So the book came out and was launched this last May. We had a real successful launch at the Chicago History Museum with White Sox, old White Sox stars Don Paul on the left, who was from Evergreen Park, who lived out every Sox fan's dream of getting to play for his hometown team. Jack McDowell, who of course was the 93 AL Cy Young winner. You'll see Matt Flesch right to the right of me. Then Ron Kittle, the 83 Rookie of the Year. Tom Scher, longtime scorer and NBC broadcaster, was our MC. And Nancy Faust, who injured her ankle and broke it during spring training, came off the injured list and shocked us by playing for all the 200 plus fans that were in attendance that night. And it was really a treat to kind of transform this ballroom at the museum into the feeling of what it was like at Old Comiskey Park. So the film came out, and it's been a really bad year for White Sox fans, and arguably the campfire milkshake and the memories back to 1990, as captured by both the film and the book, are kind of only the happy moments for White Sox fans this year. And it really kind of caused me to realize how much we've lost. And as I put this book together, I had the benefit of spending my time in the 90s and late 80s while the team was suffering. And I got to think back about where did we go wrong? And I really started to think about a series of what ifs. What if this ballpark that had these arches that were based on the Roman Colosseum had survived in some fashion? What could have been different? How could a lot of different turning points, or Wendepunkt is a word I like in German, been different, and history would have been changed? And it really goes back to before the new ballpark, which debuted on April 18, 1991, to a 0-16 loss to the Tigers, which was demolished in 1991, which I got to slowly witness as I was a vendor at the time as a college summer job. I vended for 91 through 3 at the new ballpark and captured these photos of the ballpark slowly disappearing. And as you look at it today, this is from a helicopter about a year ago in November. Nothing's really left of the old ballpark, except for those who have been there, a small display of what our home plate used to be. Um, and it goes back to a series of questions and what ifs. And one of that biggest what ifs happened just down the street, about a mile and a half, 2 miles from where I live. What if the White Sox had never met with gamblers at the Hotel Buckminster near Fenway Park in September of 1919 and agreed with Arnold Rothstein to throw the 1990 World Series? You know, at that time, the players stayed for most of their careers with teams. Sure, the Yankees became what they had become, but you kind of wonder if those 8 players had stayed with the White Sox, how different things could have been. Would the White Sox and the Yankees have been going back and forth as rivals throughout the 20s? Would the Cubs have become the dominant team eventually in Chicago? What would have happened with fans and attendance had that not occurred? It really is sort of the original sin in many ways of the White Sox. And to this day, they are still arguably suffering from what was lost when the players decided to meet with those gamblers in 1919. Um, Jacob, who is, as you see here, could speak on that topic for hours more than I could. Um, so now we've got instead these sort of fuzzy memories of what those 1990 team players are like, as evidenced by the Field of Dreams game from a couple years ago. Um, and instead, as I mentioned earlier, the Chicago Cardinals, seen here in front of the old scoreboard before it was converted into the exploding monster, were the only team that really got some success, and frankly, not much compared to the Bears in Old Comiskey. Um, and then the second question is, what would have happened if Cub fan and someone who didn't like a lot of government spending, Governor Jim Thompson, seen here at opening day at Comiskey Park in 1987, had not been able to persuade enough downstate legislators in 1987, excuse me, to pass the legislation that allowed for the building of the new Comiskey Park with the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority. It was really close. For those of you who don't know, there's this rumor that the clock was stopped in the State House at midnight, and the legislation actually passed a few minutes past midnight after the Southern Cardinal-oriented fans were singing "Na na na na, hey hey, goodbye" on the legislative floor because they did not care a whit about whether or not the White Sox moved to Florida, which was the rumor at the time. And sure enough, James Thompson, who did not want to have the White Sox lost on his watch, was instrumental in keeping the White Sox and is now rightfully memorialized outside of the home plate entrance at New Comiskey Park. By the way, you'll note I'll refer to it as New Comiskey Park or as Sox Park. I'm not a big fan of the changing corporate names, so excuse that little idiosyncrasy of mine. But the White Sox, had Jim Thompson not have done that, we're going to take over what was then called Thunderdome, or the Florida Suncoast Dome, which went on, of course, to become the longtime home of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, now Rays. And it was about to be replaced. They were already printing up the shirts for the Florida White Sox, holding the press conferences. And this kind of dump of a stadium would have been the White Sox home for a number of years. They've also flirted with the Giants, and at one point, the San Francisco Giants were going to become the Florida Giants. But Jerry Reinsdorf, when he came in, really had a notion that he wanted to replace Comiskey Park. And that's really another big question. What if, instead of replacing old Comiskey Park, they reconstructed it in a manner that was analogous to what they did just 10 years prior, 15 years prior at Yankee Stadium? For those of you who don't know, the White Sox were sold by Bill Veeck in 1981. Bill Veeck clearly saw the writing on the wall for how sports were changing and realized that he lacked sufficient funds to keep the park going. Reinsdorf came in and really changed the culture of the team to a more corporate feel, and part of that was he wanted a new park with skyboxes and luxury seating, and felt that old Comiskey Park really wasn't going to cut it. And we talk about that more in the book, but he had, gotten engineers to declare that the park wasn't worth saving, and felt that to reconstruct and rebuild it would require the White Sox to move up north to Wrigley Field or to County Stadium for a couple of years, the way that Yankee fans had to go to Shea Stadium for their time in which their park was rebuilt. But if you go back to Yankee Stadium, I would say that the Yankee fans probably really appreciated that they got another generation or two out of old Yankee Stadium. And sure, it wasn't the same as the original, but it was a lot more analogous to what the feel was and intended by the original architects. I would say that the White Sox fans would have preferred that to what at the time Eddie Einhorn labeled being a waste of money. I would say it was a waste of money having to rebuild new Comiskey Park, lopping off 8 rows and having to rebuild it. Sure, they did a better ballpark since, but the most I ever hear from fans who go there is it's okay, it's fine, it's better than it used to be, but it's not going to stir the emotions. People aren't going to write poetry about new Comiskey Park the way they do about Fenway or Wrigley Field. Um, they've upgraded it, they've changed it. You can see they've put on the roof, they've changed the lighting, they removed the top 8 rows. As someone who used to sell beer and hot dogs there, up in those upper decks, those were some pretty steep rows, and it was good for sales because fans did not want to leave their seats very much. Um, but I'd say the Sox fans would have welcomed a couple-year hiatus to County Stadium or Wrigley Field, to make that sacrifice. Um, Wrigley Field, of course, has since been rebuilt and has been preserved. I would argue not necessarily as well as Fenway Park. Um, I would suggest that things like those scoreboards in the outfield are analogous to having a 90-inch television and a small freshman dorm room. I just think they're out of scale. I think the exterior elements make it feel a little bit like you're at a suburban shopping center or lifestyle center. But they kept it. And, one of the things I think Chicagoans appreciated for a long time was having two classic old ballparks. Sadly, they only have one now. Um, and again, Fenway Park is still here from 1912. And Fenway, I would argue, was a much more successful renovation. Before Fenway was, I'm sure the Red Sox were sold to the John Henry Group in 2002. The ownership team, then run by John Harrington for the Yawkey Trust, the longtime owner, had envisioned that Fenway was going to get torn down and a replica was going to be built right next door, only keeping parts of the Green Monster, as you'll see in the top of the photo in the middle. But instead, John Henry came in and really, along with Larry Lucchino, who had previously been with the Baltimore Orioles, and the great architect Janet Marie Smith, had the mantra of do no harm and buy into the notion of save Fenway Park. And sure enough, they did that. Over a 12-year period, they slowly made changes to the park, modernizing it for at least 2 more generations, incorporating elements that sometimes when I bring fans who had never been there, or haven't been there for a long time, cannot discern what is new and what is post 2004 vintage. And obviously the Green Monster is drastically different. Here seen on opening day in 2003, I believe. And here it is now. It's just a completely different experience, but it somehow fits within Boston and fits within Fenway Park. And they've been very sensitive about how that they have modified the park. And now, the seats on the top of the Green Monster provide one of the best views in all of baseball. And they found different elements within Fenway Park that they could use. Part of the roof deck is now a year-round garden for which they provide food to the restaurants within the ballpark. They put in seating in all kinds of creative places while still keeping the skyline views. They've even taken old storage areas and turned them into a bar that's a year-round bar, providing views of the field for fans who just want to capture a glimpse of the ballpark. They've, of course, closed off Jersey Street, formerly known as Yawkey Way, on day of game to allow for more circulation in a less confined area. The area to the left, by the way, is about to embark on a major renovation and reconstruction. The entire neighborhood really has morphed into something quite successful since they kept the ballpark. Arguably something that Comiskey might have experienced, how they done something similar with Old Comiskey. And Fenway remains, a gem, still part of the ballpark, part of the city, and part of the neighborhood. Another thing that they could have done, and another what if, is adaptive reuse. Soldier Field, which was built in the 20s as a monument to World War One heroes, was never intended to be a football stadium. It was intended to be a lot of things, athletics and other sports, but not necessarily football. And it was never a great stadium in a lot of ways, despite people sort of glorifying it in years past. And I would argue that they did a wonderful job preserving some elements of the old stadium. My children still get to go through the same gate-o that I used to go to with my dad. They feel kind of what it was like to go to a Bear game in the old days. They still can see those beautiful neoclassical art columns, but they experience a modern stadium on the inside, which I would suggest is a much more interesting architectural design than a lot of other modern football stadiums. It's more analogous to what you see in Europe, where they blend new architecture with old architecture and really allow both to live side by side. Something like that could have also been done potentially. Um, Here are some before and afters of Soldier Field. You can see some parts still exist, some don't. You still get those jaw-dropping skyline views, but with really good sight lines that arguably are a lot better than what old Soldier Field provided. Here's another view. The top view is from 1985 in the NFC playoffs, and the bottom views from last year. But right after the second they lost to the Eagles in 2001, they were yanking out. This is the next morning. They yanked out chairs and started that renovation, and they started to build a new stadium within an old stadium. And it was, in my mind, a successful venture. I know a lot of Chicagoans and Bear fans differ on that, but I personally like it a lot. Here's just some more photos showing the mixture of the different architectural styles. And as I said before, where I live in Boston, you see it all over the city, an old facade with a new building on the inside. Here's in the South End, you see a modern condo building within the building envelope of an old Boston penny savings bank. Um, the other thing you could have done, and another what if, is could you have kept some element of the ballpark for another use? My football soccer team that I follow is Arsenal in North London, which played for almost a century in Highbury, Arsenal Stadium, which was built just a couple years after Old Comiskey. And they converted that after moving into kind of a bland a new ground about a mile away that if you look closely, it looks a lot like new Comiskey Park in soccer form. But unlike Comiskey Park, they kept elements of the old building and turned it into flats. Where the soccer pitch used to exist is now a garden where residents or old fans can come and sit. It's open to the public. Um, there are flats that look on to the pitch and people can remember where great plays happened. The old facade here shown in 2002 essentially still looks the same. They use the same lobby that they used to use for the team to now enter the flats. And another example is Busch Stadium in Indianapolis. Here, seen also in 8 Men Out, it was used, another tie to the White Sox. It was let to rot after they went and moved downtown, and now has been converted into real successful loft apartments that are quite beautiful and still show you this is before and here's after what it feels like to have been in that old ballpark. Canada really is leaps and bounds ahead of the US on this. The old Montreal Forum where the Canadians played was converted into a mixed use entertainment facility. And you can still go see where the Habs used to play inside of where the movie theater is. Similarly, in Toronto, old Maple Leaf Gardens has been converted into a college hockey arena using the same ceiling that was the one that was over an original 16 for almost a century. It also is a grocery store on the first level, and on the middle level is an athletic center and a basketball arena for a local college. Montreal for the Olympics, which is, I think, still being paid for, converted the old velodrome into quasi like a zoo environment. The Compaq Center in Houston is now a mega church. That's where the Houston Rockets used to play. It was often known as the Summit. The old Pyramid in Memphis is now a Bass Pro Shops. It was the Memphis Grizzlies arena for many years. The old, now with the U.S. Opens upon us, the old U.S. Tennis Center at Forest Hills is a concert venue. and is a beautiful venue these days. Um, some stadiums are built within other stadiums. Here at San Diego State, they kept the old Aztec Bowl football stadium and built a basketball arena within that building envelope. But sadly, not the case with Old Comiskey. Instead, it was left to be torn down. And Jerry Reinsdorf, a couple years later, had the same decision to make when the United Center replaced Chicago Stadium. And lo and behold, with another classic old stadium with distinctive architectural elements, he made the same decision, having thought about it for a few years. Um, so, the White Sox have been, um, had the misfortune of not really having someone who treasures and preserves historic preservation at their helm for the last 5 decades or 4 decades. And the Chicago Bulls are going to potentially suffer the same fate. Similarly, the United Center, not one of the better basketball arenas, a little sterile, a little bland. And instead, all we have today is this was a few years ago. It has since been spruced up, but you have the marking of where home plate used to be, which is to some degree without meaning because home plate was moved a number of times over the years. Dan Evans famously tells a story in the film, repeated in the book, that it was Raleigh Heeman and he that discussed moving it forward 9 feet in '83, which helped the White Sox win the division that year. So we don't have anything. Could you have had a restaurant? Could you have had flats? Could you have had a souvenir store, a pub, parking, anything? But instead, a lot of us have these chairs or bricks. But Governor Thompson ended up, along with others, auctioning off a lot of the ballpark. Even Steve Dahl, the guy that was part of Disco Demolition in 1979, was part of the auction, selling off the ballpark in 1991. And it's now throughout the world. Better than that was in Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. Many of you probably have seen Maz's wall is still there. You can still see where that famous home run went over the left field wall. The home plate is inside Pitt's campus and a few other elements. Boston, just down the street from me, still has a big part of the stands for where Braves Field used to be. It's now part of Boston University's Nickerson Field. The right field bleachers or stands now are part of the stadium where students graduate and where soccer's played. For a while, it was a football stadium. League Park still has their ticket booth in Cleveland, which has been recently renovated into a ball field for high school players to play. Even Atlanta, not exactly known for historic preservation, kept up the wall that was Hank Aaron's home run location. So what if Reinsdorf had done something like that? Yankee Stadium's another one. They've kept up a lot of elements of old Yankee Stadium when they moved next door. And really, you can get a sense of the place of what Yankee Stadium used to be like. Detroit, sadly, made the same mistake, tore down Tiger Stadium. They did build a new park there, but not much is left there to remind us. Here's another good one, a decent example in Milwaukee, where County Stadium used to be. There's a little kids field. A real interesting one in Denver is they recently built this little miniature version of Mile High Stadium, which used to be started as the baseball stadium for the Denver Bears, then became the Broncos Stadium, then of course became the Colorado Rockies Stadium for a few years. I recently, on the way to SABR in Minneapolis, stopped in Omaha to see Rosenblatt Stadium's replacement, where the College World Series had been for many years in the Omaha Royals. They did a wonderful job of preserving elements of the old ballpark, seating, the old foul lines, and you can kind of get a sense of it. But alas, not the same for Comiskey Park. They arguably could have built something that was more analogous. Here's another what if question, sort of like New Yankee Stadium being kind of a facsimile of old Yankee Stadium. Mileage may vary. Some Yankee Stadium fans really hate the new one. I think it's not a bad replacement. I would have taken a new version of Comiskey Park. They argued that these arches were going to be evocative of old Comiskey Park. Most of them hide behind the ramps, which originally were designed to be round ramps that were going to revolve, but for cost-saving measures had to be ones that obscured these arches. Here's an example showing what old Yankee Stadium is. compared to new Yankee Stadium, a sort of a similar view. And you get a sense of both parks being somewhat similar, both from outside and from inside. And even City Field evokes old Ebbets Field with their beautiful facade. Um, and then the other question we have is, why did they face the ballpark away from one of the most beautiful skylines in the world? You've got this great skyline, and the argument that I've heard is soil conditions prevented us from getting Comiskey Park facing north and instead faced the projects. Um, Arguably, dollars could have solved some soil conditioned issues. As a longtime real estate lawyer, I know that you can always overcome any soil issue. The other thing is, could they have built a ballpark that fit within the neighborhood in a way that was tantamount to the way they used to be done, where ballparks were squeezed into cities and you got unique shapes like Fenway Park or Crosley Field? But in Pittsburgh, you get one of the all-time great views, and we don't have that in Chicago. This would have been the view. This is the view from the top ramps of New Comiskey Park today, or just this last year. And this was the view. You know, when it first opened, you got a little bit of the lake, which you don't get as much anymore now that they've lopped off those top 8 rows. But there were some really unsightly housing projects, which have since been torn down and replaced by much more sensitive housing since then. This shows what it kind of looked like from the upper deck in those days. And instead, you could have had a beautiful view. Here's one of the finest views of any ballpark. This is the University of Illinois at Chicago's Curtis Granderson Field, which is pretty close to where the White Sox toyed with building a ballpark in the South Loop and may still today build a ballpark. It could have been the view. Um, Ironically, the White Sox have 2 minor league facilities with fantastic views. This is their ballpark in Charlotte, where the Charlotte Knights play. And here's their ballpark in Birmingham, their AA team, which has a great view of the skyline in Birmingham. But the White Sox instead, were trying to move away from the round cookie cutter donuts of the 70s and 60s. And at the time, the ballpark that was in vogue was Royal Stadium. And Jerry Reinsdorf loved Royal Stadium. He was given an opportunity to build something like Camden Yards by HOK, which is now known as Populous, who also built Camden Yards. He chose to go with this model instead, after being provided with a model that was going to be a little bit different. Ironically, when Larry Lucchino received a design for Camden Yards, which was this original design, he told me in an interview before he passed away that he decided that he was going to tear up the actual physical model of the new Camden Yards because he didn't like how much it looked like New Comiskey Park. At the time, there already was one example of a retro field. Pilot Field at the time in Buffalo was where the Buffalo Bisons had debuted in their new stadium in 1988. But Reinsdorf really wanted to build something like Royal Stadium, which was really a suburban type ballpark, but it was at least baseball only. So you can see the similarities if you go back and forth between the two. This was from promotional materials provided to fans in the late 80s. And the ballpark pretty much looks like what those promotional materials provided. You can see how it dwarfs the old park. And the other option he could have gone is going something super ultra modern, like what the Sky Dome was, now known as Rogers Center. That cost about double in $1990 of what Comiskey Park was, and there just wasn't the money or the willingness to spend that. As a lot of us know, Reinsdorf has not been really forthcoming with spending his own money on stadiums, and he certainly wasn't going to do it then. And it's hard for baseball fans and White Sox fans in particular to not look at the ballparks that debuted in the subsequent decade and not get a little jealous and green with envy. Some real gems of ballparks throughout the country and really throughout the world, but that was not Reinsdorf's presence. And he's talking about now the same thing in the same story. He's flirting with Nashville, and this is not a man who necessarily worries about offending the fans. He got rid of Harry Carey in 1981 and let him go to the North Side. He got rid of Jason Benetti this last year, fan favorite, and let him go to rival Detroit. Of course, Nancy Faust is no longer playing the organ at Comiskey. Instead, she's luckily gracing the keys at minor league ballparks all throughout the country. But Nancy would love to come back and play once or twice a summer, and that's not something that the ownership really has listened to fans about. And going back further, Andy the Clown, love him or hate him, he was not welcome at the new ballpark. He pretty much finished at the old ballpark. So similarly with Chicago and the Bulls, Scottie Pippen and the Last Dance, we all know that story. But this is a guy who took the White Sox off of free TV, put them on pay TV in the early 80s when the Cubs were on national cable in the day. At the time, they were charging, if you look closely, $21.95 a month for the Bulls, Blackhawks, Sting, and the White Sox. Fast forward to that being about $72 in today's money for just those teams. And you compare that to what a sports package costs today, it was a ridiculous amount of money and just arguably not something that was going to work with White Sox fans. So he's talked about going to the South Loop in this Parcel 78, which is seen here, which certainly would be a wonderful upgrade in terms of location. You'd get views of the skyline. You'd get riverboats bringing fans from hotels. The L would be right there, be part of a larger development, similar to what we see in Atlanta. But he's toying with other cities. He's dangling Nashville. And, other teams have done it. We all know that the Montreal Expos, UP was yanked around from Montreal to San Juan, Puerto Rico, to then going to the Nationals, becoming the Washington Nationals at RFK Park and being replaced now with Nationals Park. We no longer have the Expos. And you take one of the finest mascots in the world and you replace them with this hodgepodge of presidents and ex-presidents and chickens or whatever that guy is. Although I will admit, in fairness, I have hung out with him at a bar mitzvah in DC, so I do have to admit that bias. And sure enough, we're down to our last few weeks, again, of the Oakland A's playing in the Coliseum. And soon they're going to be playing no longer in this big bowl. The sun is setting on the Oakland A's, and they're going to be soon following out to Vegas and the Raiders, and are going to be playing along with the Raiders fans. They're going to be first in Sacramento for a year, and then playing on essentially this lot where the Tropicana hotel and resort was just torn down. So will they be the Nashville White Sox in the future? We don't know. It's another series of what ifs. It's another question. And that's kind of where we stand. So we're going all back full circle. And once again, we're back to will they, won't they go to another city? So that's a conclusion. As I talked about before, the book captures the documentary. My next project that I'm working on is about all the Chicago stadiums from today and in the past. But right now, if you're interested in the book, it's available at lastcomiskeybook.com. I'm coming to town doing a bunch of library tours in the near future, and the documentary remains available as well. If we have time, I'm happy to answer any questions. Don't know how to call people or unmute. Michael? You're still on mute. Uh, Michael had a question. Anyone else? Okay. Well, then, no questions. Thank you so much for having me. This was great. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation.
Ken, I have a question.
Sure.
In terms of all of the time that you spent at Old Comiskey Park, what would you say was your favorite memory or your favorite part of the ballpark?
It was home runs. When you had a home run, it captured it all. You'd hear Nancy Faust play the organ. You hear the fans singing "na na na na." You see that scoreboard go off with the fireworks. Um, it was a ballpark that had such tremendous noise because of the way that it was constructed, that even when there was just 10,000 fans, it was loud no matter what. Plus, White Sox fans then, and I certainly saw this when I vended, drank a lot more beer than Cub fans. So it always was a little bit more raucous feeling. And you just always had that feel that was somewhere between like Mardi Gras and Menace.
So your promotional materials indicate that you took thousands of pictures at the ballpark in like the last decade and into 1990. How many pictures actually made it into the book?
About 400, about 400. Um, I've been little by little scanning in those old negatives, and it takes forever. Um, I started photographing that ballpark in 1982, and then really stepped it up in the last few years, in 1990 in particular.
Awesome stuff. Um, as far as your participation in the documentary, how many of your pictures kind of made it into the
I think
final
about
product?
30 or 40. They
Yeah,
were provided as transitional background um, for interviews when they were happening, rather than just have talking heads, sort of similar to the way that Ken Burns famously does. Matt would pan over some of the photos, give you a sense of the place and a sense of the ballpark, and capture things that the videos didn't necessarily capture.
very nice. What's your favorite thing to get when you go to Comiskey now?
A win, a
Those
win.
have been a little hard to come
It's
by.
not often. I went to two games this year. I actually got two, which is pretty rare. Um, you know what? It's always that grilled hot dog. It's unlike I've been to I think about 60 major league parks, about 600 ballparks in total. Nothing
Yeah,
like those grilled hot dogs on the bed of onions. They have not been using the poppy seed rolls the last few years, which I think is kind of a little antithetical to what the Chicago experience should be.
yeah, right.
But I'll accept the sacrilege for having better food there than Wrigley.
All right. Does anybody else have questions? We got Ken now while he's here. I'll look in the chat real quick and see.
I'd welcome also if anyone, I'm sort of workshopping this chat for other groups, and if anyone has any suggestions, parts that drag, parts that were unnecessary, parts you'd like to hear more about, I'd be happy to receive an email or hit me up on social media. Um, all comments are welcome. you know, Saber folks are not shy if they find any errors in the book. They always share with me whatever errors I have. When I post photos, if I make a mistake, I usually find out within seconds. So I always welcome the input from Saber members.
Yeah, that's what we call being sabered.
Yeah, yeah. I've learned. I've
Yeah,
learned. I learned
awesome.
not to post photos too late at night when my eyes are failing and I'm getting a little tired. If I say something occurred in 1997, someone will tell me, no, 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 98.
Awesome stuff. Well, thanks, Ken. I really appreciate you
Thanks.
doing this. Hopefully, anybody that's listening now or maybe watching this at some point later, get the book. You can get it at lastcomiskeybook.com. Ken also has a website, Stadium Vagabond, where you can find the book. You could look at his pictures. I think you sell posters and things too of the
Yeah, yeah. I
event,
sell
right?
a lot of them as prints. People, it goes all the way back to my days when I would vend. I would show my photos to the other vendors and they would want to buy the prints. So little by little, I had like this side hustle in the locker room for vending in center field at New Comiskey Park where they want to buy photos of Michael Jordan or Chicago Stadium or whatnot. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, it's all just to, support these efforts. And like, I'm trying to do a second book. I'd love to, I've got as many photos that I have of old Comiskey, I've got of Wrigley and Soldier Field and old Soldier Field and all the college stadiums throughout the state, et cetera. So really want to share those with Chicagoans and sports fans.
great stuff. And I want to say you probably set the record for the most photographs shown in an hour presentation that I've ever seen. Like you
Yeah.
rocked it, man.
Mhm.
It was great. Good
All right,
stuff.
not too fast.
No, it wasn't too fast. Not for me.
Okay.
No, it was
All
just
right.
interesting. It flowed.
Okay,
So
because I added about 50 yesterday. So Um,
Great stuff.
I realized some parts were missing. So
You've been on some amazing adventures, so it's pretty cool to see.
yeah,
Well,
I have the boring half of my life as a lawyer, and then try to live as much excitement when I'm not at a desk drafting documents.
yep, I understand that. All right. Well, I think that does it for this session. I appreciate you coming, Ken.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, this was recorded, so if anybody knows somebody that would enjoy watching it, make sure you let them know. I would expect that Jacob will probably have it posted in the next few days or whatever, but good stuff. Thanks again, Ken.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Great.
All right. Bye.